I have a list of the most extreme unsolved mysteries on the planet. I need your help to choose one that we're gonna recreate and solve. That was the last sound anyone ever heard from Flight CS-59 on August 2nd, 1947. What makes this flight so interesting is there were only 6 people on board, and one of them was a British CIA messenger. Convenient for a disappearance of an airplane, don't you think? Just a couple weeks before this, you may recall a small UFO crash in Roswell, New Mexico. Yeah, and 300 more sightings in the next 6 months. I'm sure they have nothing to do with each other. This plane was known as Stardust, and on the morning of August 2nd, 1947, it was leaving Buenos Aires, headed to Santiago, Chile. Should have only been a 3-hour flight. Well, they did all their check-ins, everything was going well, until they received this message. ETA, Santiago, 1745 hours, Stendek. The controller was confused what he had heard because he had never heard of Stendek before, so he asked them to repeat it a second time, and it came back. ETA, Santiago, 1745, Stendek. The guy was still super confused. He said, one more time. And it came back exactly the same thing. ETA, Santiago, 1745, Stendek. And that was the last time anyone has heard from that flight. And the British CIA messenger. To this day, no one is still sure what the pilot meant by Stendek. Lots of guesses out there, maybe an acronym from World War II about distress, or maybe it was the code for the airport. A lot of people have guessed, but still no one has definitively figured out what Stendek means. And yet still there's others that think that maybe the pilot was flying into some clouds and behind those clouds was a really hard mountain. I don't buy it. I think it was the UFO guys that beamed him up. And they sent that out that said, see you later in December. That's what I think. They've never been heard from since. In 1998, 2 hikers found the airplane wreckage near the top of one of the mountain peaks with human remains confirmed to be those on board. I still think it was aliens. Although that does remind me, I need to pick up some more carbon credits when I go to Costco. March 15th, not 1, but 2 Lockheed L-1049 Super Constellations crashed. They left the same airport on the same day at about the same time. The year was 1962. John F. Kennedy was president and in no way involved in any conspiracies. The Vietnam War was just warming up, and the Russians decided to put some bottle rockets on Cuba. Airplane 1 left Travis Air Force Base, California. Side note, that's where I was born. Ha! Headed toward Alaska. They were carrying some secret military cargo. Convenient. They took off, and within minutes they noticed something wasn't right, so they turned around and landed back at Travis and discovered that a hydraulic door had been left open. Then they took off again, headed for the Aleutian Islands. They made their first stop, no problems, landed, got fuel, dropped some cargo, and then headed to Adak, Alaska, way out there where, that's right, you can see Russia. Flying into Adak, they encountered some typical crappy southern Alaska weather, and the pilot was like, hey guys, I got this. So he flew it in on an instrument approach. For those non-aviation folk, that's where you can't see anything and you're just guessing at where the runway is going to be below you. And he nailed that landing. No problems whatsoever. Besides landing 300 feet short of the runway, the plane bursting into flames, and killing one guy. Otherwise, it was a perfect landing. Because I'm sure, besides messing with the hydraulic door, that wouldn't have been a ruse to then mess with maybe his instruments so he wouldn't know exactly where he was at and increase the odds of a potential accident and make it look like pilot error. Who would do that in those years with airplanes carrying secret government supplies? Makes no sense. Well, it gets better because the second airplane that took off only an hour after that airplane was carrying pretty much the entire 75th Army Military Intelligence Regiment. That's right, those people that have trained to listen in on some Russian spy stuff. I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm just saying those were the people on board and that's what they were trained to do. They took off from Travis Air Force Base about an hour after Alaska Boy. They landed in Honolulu, Hawaii, where they had to have some engine work done. Interesting. On 2 of the 4 engines. After they got fuel in Guam, they headed out and about an hour and a half later made their standard radio call announcing their position, speed, location, all that information. And that was the last time anyone heard from them. Except for one boat, a Liberian tanker, that just happened to be in the vicinity at the exact same time that they saw a big red flash and 2 things on fire going into the ocean. Not saying could have been Russians. At the exact same time also, conveniently enough, all the radios went down for 9 minutes. You can't make this stuff up. No pieces, parts, or evidence was ever found. They straight up Epstein this dude. Speaking of the Clintons, Malaysia flight MH370. This thing was carrying 239 people over the South China Sea. 2 of the passengers were Iranians with stolen passports. Also on board were 2,000 kilos of lithium-ion batteries. I wonder if those guys had cell phones. When it got near Vietnam, poof, just vanished into thin air. Magically, both transponders happened to turn off and malfunction or quit working at the exact same time. There was a whole bunch of people looking for this airplane, and then a couple of days later, the Malaysian military came out and said, hey guys, don't ask, don't tell, but we were tracking that airplane and every other airplane in the area and listening in as well. And yeah, you guys lost it, and as soon as those transponders were turned off, stopped working, it made a hard U-turn and headed back in the other direction and then went a long ways and then headed south. But you didn't hear from us. Don't ask how we got the information, or we're definitely not listening and recording every other thing in that area. So you're welcome, but go look over here. A year later, a chunk of this airplane was positively identified over 2,000 miles away on the African coast. My question is, what happened to these 239 people and the airplane, and why did it end up way, way off track from where it was? I'll tell you why. This is my theory. Follow with me. The pilot was a secret government agent, and he hijacked this airplane. He built his own flight simulator at his house and practiced this for months. And then, when he did it, and flew the other direction and disappeared, the government covered it up because they didn't want you to know. That's what I think happened. Okay, now that's crazy. That's like some Alex Jones crazy nonsense stuff.
In late June of 2014, several news outlets reported that a special investigation had identified the captain of Flight 370 as a prime suspect. A search of the captain's home had uncovered a flight simulator which supposedly contained a suspicious route which ended in the southern Indian Ocean.
What?
At the time, there was no official acknowledgement that such a route had been recovered, and a lengthy public report issued by the Malaysian government in 2015 made no mention of such a discovery. Then, in 2016, confidential documents pertaining to a forensic examination conducted by the Royal Malaysia Police in May of 2014 was leaked to the media. These documents made it clear that such a route had not only been recovered, but thoroughly examined. Soon thereafter, the Malaysian government confirmed the existence of this simulated flight path, and this is what it looks like.
Told ya! Nailed it! I love a good conspiracy. On April 28th, 2020, while the rest of the world was closed to a pandemic, the essential cargo flights had increased dramatically. Anchorage, Alaska just happens to be halfway between the United States and Walmart. And on April 28th, 2020, when everybody else was shut down, Anchorage, Alaska was the world's busiest airport. A few years earlier, in 1951, Anchorage was not the world's busiest airport. There was a flight 3505 departing from Vancouver, British Columbia, headed to Tokyo, Japan, with a stop in Anchorage for fuel and supplies, and it disappeared. This flight was part of Operation Korea Airlift. If you don't know what that is, it's a United Nations operation that used United States airplanes to do, and I quote, provide air support to the air war in Korea by landing and dropping supplies, troop transport, paratroop operations, and my personal favorite, psychological operations. I mean, why wouldn't they? This is the official final statement. No traces of the aircraft or its occupants has been found to date. The cause of the disappearance has not been determined. The last known position was 80 miles west of Juneau, Alaska, about an hour and a half from Anchorage. The weather was poor. It's in the Pacific Northwest, which is known to rain on occasion. And you have some really, really big mountains on one side and a really big ocean on the other side. Oh, and it was at night. That makes for the perfect cover story. It was the Russians. Yeah, I know. 2016 presidential election, totally the Russians. That president, totally Russia. The 2020 elections was the most secure election in world history. The flat tire I got this morning, definitely Russia. My tire was pooting out air all over the place. Oh, man. No, seriously, it was Russia. July 17th, 1996. TWA Flight 800 took off from JFK Airport. He's been on this list already. Headed for Paris. 12 minutes later, it exploded over the shores of Long Island, New York. There were 230 people on board and no one survived. Many eyewitnesses describe seeing something like a streak of light ascending, moving to the point where the airplane was, and then that fireball split into two and descended back to the earth. Intense public interest arose in the witness of these reports, and much speculation was that that light was a rocket. Well, the largest investigation in aviation history ensued, and it took them 4 years to issue the report. The official report says, probable cause of the accident was a spark in the center fuel tank that eventually led to the explosion that brought down the aircraft. While they offered their best theory as to where the spark came from, they never found a definitive answer. Reminds me of another flight that was around New York a few years later. Yet only 56 seconds is all it took for them to find a fully intact, unscathed passport of a suspected terrorist hijacker. Less than an hour. Boom. They had their answer that they wanted. I mean, they found the evidence they needed to support. I mean, that's what they found and that's their official story, and it's silly to question anything that could be otherwise. Aviation authorities say a commercial airliner that flew out of Germany in 1954 has landed in Brazil with 92 skeletons on board. And while the officials refuse to speculate on the whereabouts of the plane for the last 35 years, several respected scientists, including paranormal researcher Dr. Celso Atillo, say Santiago Airlines Flight 513 almost certainly entered a time warp. There is no other explanation, Dr. Atillo told newsmen in Porto Alegre, Brazil. Flight records show that the aircraft left Aachen, West Germany, on the morning of September 4th, 1954, and then vanished over the Atlantic Ocean near the Bermuda Triangle on its way to Porto Alegre later that day. At the time, aviation authorities assumed it had crashed, but the plane landed in Porto Alegre a few weeks ago on October 2nd. It was piloted by the skeleton of its captain, and all the crew and passengers were dead too. Officials don't want to discuss explanations, but they cannot deny that this airplane had defied the laws of space and time, and God only knows how a skeleton managed to land it. Santiago Airlines went out of business in 1956, and executives who are still alive don't know enough about the flight to comment. Brazilian aviation officials themselves confirmed that the vintage Lockheed Super Constellation had appeared out of nowhere and landed at an airstrip west of Porto Alegre on October 2nd. They also said its powerful turboprop engines were still idling when support personnel found the skeletal remains of 88 passengers and a 4-man crew, including Captain Miguel Victor Curre, who was still clutching the controls. Government agents are known to be investigating the mysterious flight, but they refuse to discuss anything about the airplane or the course their investigation is taking. The official shroud of secrecy has outraged Dr. Ateo and other experts who are now calling on the Brazilian government to let civilians assist in the investigation effort. Rodrigo de Mana, a retired physics professor in Porto Alegre, said the public has a right to know everything about this plane, and the government has a duty to tell them. If this plane did enter a time warp, and there is evidence to prove it, the entire world should be told. Something like this could change the way we view our world and alter science as we know it. It is a crime to keep information like this secret, especially from the relatives of the people who perished on Santiago Airlines Flight 513. Just before this airplane, an entire squadron of Navy airplanes was lost in the Bermuda Triangle. On December 5th, 1945 at 2:10 p.m., 14 airmen flying 5 World War II torpedo bombers called Avengers took off from the Naval Air Station on a routine training mission over the Bermuda Triangle and were never seen again. Flight 19 was scheduled to take them due east 67 miles, then turn north for 73 miles until finally back to the air station, a distance of only 120 miles. Well, 2 hours after the flight began, the leader of the squadron, who had been flying that area for more than 6 months, reported that his compass and backup compass had failed and that his position was unknown. The other planes experienced similar instrument malfunctions. Radio facilities on land were contacted to find the location of the lost squadron, but none were successful. 3 hours later, they sent out a rescue airplane filled with 13 crew. 3 minutes after takeoff, that mariner radioed back saying its mission was underway, and that was the last anyone ever heard of this airplane. The Bermuda Triangle had taken yet another one. Well, 30 years after this event, one group said they found these airplanes in Mexico's Sonoran Desert. All the airplanes were intact and operational, yet the pilots and crew had vanished. In 1972, the Old Christians Club chartered Uruguayan Air Force plane to transport the team from Montevideo, Uruguay to Santiago, Chile. Santiago makes this list yet again. On October 12th, the twin-engine turboprop left the airport carrying 5 crew members and 40 passengers. And on board was a rugby team. Because of poor weather in the mountains, they were delayed overnight and had to leave the next day. Although Santiago lay to the west of Mendoza, the Fairchild airplane was not built to fly higher than 22,500 feet. So the pilots plotted a course south to the pass of Planchon, where the aircraft could safely clear the Andes. Approximately an hour after takeoff, the pilot notified air controllers that he was flying over the pass. And shortly thereafter, he radioed that he had reached Curitiba, Chile, 110 miles south of Santiago. And he turned north, and the controllers cleared him to begin his descent and prepare for landing. Shortly after, the Chilean tower was never able to contact the airplane. After 8 days, the search was called off. Over 2 months later, on December 20th, 2 men walked out of those mountains alive. Oh wait, it gets tastier. Turns out, these dudes that walked out of there, they were eating the other people. Seriously? So many things are going through my mind right now. Come to find out, this whole thing was caused because the pilot was a man. I know. He didn't bother to ask for directions. And he got turned around, got lost in the clouds, and bam! Crashed right into that mountain. Turns out those clouds are not as soft and fluffy as one might think. I'm starting to see a theme here, people. Amelia Earhart, on the other hand, that is one crazy redhead that gets stuff done. In 1932, she was the first woman to cross the Atlantic solo. Boom. 3 months later, she said, I'm gonna fly all the way across the US, the long way, and all at once, without stopping. Boom, no problem. She thought, well, heck, that was easy. Let's just go all the way. Full send. That's what I'm talking about. So, March 17th, 1937, she took off from Oakland and flew west on an around-the-world attempt. Now, this was not a first around-the-world flight, but it was the longest. 29,000 miles. You really gotta like the other person that you're with to be in a little tiny pop can for that long. Whew. That is quite the trip. She took off from Oakland, landed in Hawaii, fueled up, and as she was getting ready to take off, she put the power to it a little too much, and she spun out and ended up messing up the airplane. They think it was because she blew a tire. It's possible, I guess. Well, anyway, it messed up the airplane pretty bad, so they had to ship it all the way back to the US. Got it fixed a couple months later. And then she's like, let's do this thing again, because we're not gonna give up. We're not quitters. We're Americans. Her and Fred got in that thing, and this time, instead of going that way, they decided, let's try going that way. So they took off from Miami, and then they flew through the Bermuda Triangle, landed in South America, then Africa, and then India, Southeast Asia. They had flown 22 of the 29,000 miles. They had one more major leg, and that was to go across the Pacific. That is a big pond. Their fuel stop was a little tiny island out in the middle of flipping nowhere that only had one little weather observation station and a landing strip, and that was it. There's nothing else out there. They had fuel and, supplies ready for her when she landed there at this thing. They even had a Coast Guard cutter, the Itasca. Amelia radioed the Itasca and explained that she was low on fuel. However, after several hours of frustrating attempts, two-way communication was only briefly established, and the Itasca was unable to pinpoint the Lockheed's location or offer navigational information. She circled the Itasca's position but was unable to sight the ship despite it giving out miles of black smoke. Carbon credits, people. Neutral. Should have been an electric ship. Gosh, people. She radioed one last time. 1/2 hour fuel. No landfall. Soon after, contact was lost. Presumably, she tried to land it on the water. What happened?
It ain't got no gas in it.
That's what they want you to believe. Some speculate that she was actually a spy for the US government, and her around the world trip was nothing more than a ruse to gather intelligence on other countries. And she actually landed in the Marshall Islands near Saipan. Once she was there on that Japanese-controlled island, she was captured and held and interrogated. The Japanese then released her and repatriated her to New Jersey under the name Irene Bolam. She made it through the Bermuda Triangle, or did she? June 20th, 2005. 3 souls vanished into the Bermuda Triangle while flying a Piper PA-23 Aztec. Wait, an Aztec? That's the Blue Tarp Special! But come to think of it, that's about the year that thing stopped flying. Wait a second. They departed Treasure Cay, Bahamas for the short flight back to Fort Pierce, Florida, when the plane disappeared. At 11:05, the pilot calls ZMA, which is Miami Center, the controller, and advises that they are in severe turbulence and requests help out of the weather. There was no response from the pilot. The controller attempts to contact the pilot several more times with no response. And those people on that flight on that day had disappeared into the Bermuda Triangle. Holy disappearing airplane, Batman! I've got the same airplane, and the Bermuda Triangle is right next door. We gotta go check this out. I wanna see this for myself. Can I get a clear up?